When every expert failed to reach the billionaire's silent son, a humble maid unlocked the voice the world thought he'd never have. Richard Hale, a billionaire tech magnate, had everything except peace. His 7-year-old son, Evan Hale, born deaf after complications at birth, hadn't spoken a word, signed consistently, or allowed anyone near him. He lived behind walls taller than the mansion itself, walls built from trauma, silence, and fear. 22 nannies had quit. Some lasted a week. Some lasted a day. One quit after 30 minutes. Evan would throw things, hide, scream silently, and refuse any form of interaction. Richard loved him deeply but felt powerless. He was a genius in business, but a failure as a father. When the 23rd nanny stormed out crying, shouting, "That boy needs help, not money," Richard finally broke. "I don't know what he needs," he whispered into the empty hall. And that's when someone, completely unexpected, walked into their lives. Her name was Marion Brooks, a quiet, sharp-eyed black woman in her early 40s, the kind of person people walked past without truly seeing. She moved through the billionaire's mansion like a soft breeze, felt but never acknowledged. She wasn't hired as a nanny. She wasn't hired as a caretaker. She was hired as a simple maid, part-time, responsible only for the West Wing, the side of the house most people forgot existed. Marion didn't complain. She needed the job, needed the stability, needed to keep her head low. The mansion buzzed with the hurried footsteps of overpaid professional nannies, therapists, specialists, consultants, each one confident they knew exactly how to fix the billionaire's deaf son. But none of them noticed the small details. None of them paid attention to the way the boy's shoulders tightened or the way his gaze flickered like a trapped bird searching for an escape. But Marion did. She noticed everything, even when she pretended not to. On her first week, she saw how Evan flinched whenever someone approached too quickly, as if their movements sliced through the air like invisible blades. She observed how he pressed his fingertips against the wooden walls, closing his eyes, reading the world not through sound, but through vibrations. She watched the way his eyes scanned the ceiling, the floor, the corners, as if measuring distances and patterns others were blind to. While the specialists barked instructions he couldn't hear, Marion saw him studying their mouths, not in hope of understanding them, but in fear of their frustration. She recognized that fear. It was the same fear she once carried as a child, being misunderstood, blamed for things she couldn't control, dismissed before she ever had a chance to explain herself. Unlike others, she did not rush him. She did not corner him with pity or overwhelm him with forced enthusiasm. She simply worked. Quietly, gently, present but never intrusive. And slowly, without anyone noticing, Evan began to drift closer to her whenever she cleaned the West Wing hallway. He would hover in the corner, silent as always, watching her wipe down shelves or fold linens. He didn't look afraid of her. That alone was strange enough to make Marion pause. One afternoon, while dusting a bookshelf, she dropped a small wooden figurine. It struck the floor with a soft clatter Evan didn't hear, but he felt it. His head snapped up. His eyes locked onto the figurine before it even settled. He walked over, picked it up, and traced the point where it hit the ground. His fingers moved with deliberate curiosity, like he was reading its story. Marion didn't speak. She didn't need to. She simply opened her palm. Slowly, he placed the figurine into her hand, and for the first time their eyes met. Not briefly, not fearfully, but with recognition. Two people who moved through life quietly. Two people the world overlooked. Two people who understood more than they ever said. From that day onward, Evan always knew when she was in the West Wing. He would feel the soft rhythm of her steps through the floorboards. He would appear in doorways, watching her, following her cleaning path like a shadow made of silence. The other staff dismissed it. "He wanders everywhere," they said. "It's not personal." But Marion knew better. His movements had rhythm around her. His breathing softened. His shoulders didn't tense. He felt safe, not because she tried, but because she didn't try too hard. Marion had no credentials, no degrees, no certifications. She had only her instincts, shaped by years of navigating a world that rarely listened to people like her. And in Evan, she saw a child carrying the same invisible weight, the weight of being misunderstood, the weight of being spoken about but never spoken to, the weight of feeling alone even in a house full of people. She noticed the little things others overlooked, how he tapped his fingers against surfaces to feel the echo, how he tracked light reflections like language, how he calmed when movements were slow and deliberate. She understood it because she too had learned to read the world differently, quietly, patiently, with a heart trained to pick up what others ignored. Marion knew she wasn't hired to help him, but she also knew she was the only one who truly saw him. And sometimes, seeing someone, really seeing them, was the first step toward unlocking a voice the world believed didn't exist. It happened by accident, the kind of accident no one could have predicted, the kind that reshapes the direction of lives without warning. Marion was polishing a delicate crystal vase that sat on an ornate marble pedestal in the West Wing hallway. She had wiped it 1,000 times since she started working there, but today her hand slipped. The vase slid from her grasp, spinning in the air like a slow-motion disaster, before it struck the polished floor and burst into 1,000 glittering shards. The sharp tinkling sound meant nothing to Evan, but the impact, the vibration was everything. Evan, who had been half hidden under the staircase like a small animal retreating into a den, froze in place. His eyes widened not in fear, but in astonishment, as though the world had just revealed a secret meant only for him. The tremor traveled through the floorboards, up the wooden beams, and into his palms pressed against the stairs. Marion saw it instantly. She saw the way his fingers trembled, not with panic, but with recognition. His entire posture shifted, his breathing slowed, his eyes locked onto the shattered glass like he was tracing the invisible ripples of sound through touch alone. Marion didn't speak, she didn't rush. She crouched down beside the broken vase and placed her own hand flat on the wooden floor. Slowly, deliberately, she tapped her knuckles against the wood. Tap, 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 tap. She wasn't following a rhythm she learned from some specialist handbook. She was following instinct, the same instinct that had always guided her through the quiet corners of life. Evan blinked, his fingers twitched. Then, with astonishing precision, he tapped back, tap, 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 a perfect imitation, the exact rhythm, the exact spacing, the exact pressure. Marion's breath caught in her chest, her heart hammered. For a moment she forgot the mess on the floor, forgot the mansion around her, forgot even her own life outside those walls. It was just the two of them, connected by vibrations, speaking without sound. This wasn't random. This wasn't mimicry. This was communication. The first real attempt he had made with any human being, not through words, not through signs, but through the language he trusted, the language of touch and rhythm. She slowly tapped again, this time a different pattern. He responded again, adjusting his taps, following her cue like the world had finally begun to speak in a way he could understand. Marion felt a sting behind her eyes. It was the kind of moment people waited an entire lifetime to witness, yet she wasn't even hired for this. She was just the maid, the person everyone ignored. And yet, Evan chose her. Or maybe he chose the silence she carried, the gentleness she moved with, the lack of pressure she placed on him. But the moment shattered as quickly as the vase had. Richard, the billionaire father, stormed into the hallway after hearing the crash from his office. "What happened?" he began sharply, but then froze. He saw his son, not hiding, not curled up, not withdrawn, but tapping the floor with an expression of connection. Astonishment washed over his face. He had never seen Evan like this. Not with the experts, not with the therapists, not even with him. What is he doing? Richard whispered, stepping closer, too close, too loud, too sudden. Evan flinched. The tiny spark inside him, the fragile thread of trust, snapped instantly. He jerked back, burying his face in his arms, shutting down completely as if retreating behind an invisible wall he had learned to build out of necessity. Marion moved subtly between the two, not blocking Richard, but shielding Evan from the intensity of his presence. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't panic. She simply said softly, "He doesn't trust adults who speak loudly. He trusts the world he can feel." Richard stared at her, stunned. It wasn't the words he reacted to, it was the certainty with which she said them. The certainty that came not from training, but from understanding. Real, human understanding. He looked at her then not as the maid who polished floors and dusted shelves, but as someone who had just unlocked something the specialists had failed to reach for years. Someone who saw his son not as a medical case, but as a person with his own language and logic. For the first time, Richard Brooks truly saw Marion Brooks, not the maid, not the employee, but the only person his son had ever responded to, and she hadn't even been trying. Instead of speaking or signing, Marion began using vibrations. It started subtly, almost experimentally, as though she were learning a new dialect that only existed between wooden floors, trembling air, and shared silence. She tapped patterns on furniture, not loud taps, but gentle, thoughtful ones. She drummed lightly on the floorboards, letting the rhythm travel through the beams like a message hidden inside the bones of the house. She used the hum of vacuum cleaners, slowing her movement so Evan could feel the shift from strong vibration to soft. She used the thump of folded laundry placed onto a table, turning ordinary chores into meaningful cues. She even used the rattle of window blinds when she pulled them down, letting the vibrations ripple across the frame with intention. Each vibration meant something, and slowly, they began building an entire language out of touch and resonance. Tap tap meant hello. Tap pause tap tap meant come here. A soft brush on the table meant are you okay? And Evan understood, not with hesitation, not with confusion, but with the kind of clarity children usually reserve for their mother tongue. He blossomed. The boy who used to hide behind curtains now peeked out when he felt the gentle taps. The boy who curled into himself at every loud voice now followed Marion down hallways like he was following a familiar rhythm he trusted more than sound. The boy who refused to make eye contact now looked up at her with an expression that glowed like a small flame in a dark room. He trusted her. Entirely, fully, unquestioningly. He even smiled, a rare, fragile smile that spread slowly across his face like sunlight breaking through clouds when she tapped a silly rhythm on the kitchen counter. It was a playful, bouncing beat with no meaning except joy, and Evan immediately shook with silent laughter, pressing his palms against the cabinet to feel the echo of her amusement. Marion had never heard his laughter, but she felt it, in the vibrations of the floor as he stomped lightly in excitement, in the rhythm of his taps as he tried to mimic her playful beat, in the way his shoulders loosened, the tightness around his eyes easing for the first time. She didn't need sound to know he was happy. The whole house felt different when he laughed. For the first time, someone wasn't trying to drag him into their world of noise and expectations. They weren't forcing him to read lips, or to sign properly, or to behave normally. They weren't testing him, correcting him, evaluating him. Marion didn't demand he meet her in the world of sound. Instead, she stepped into his. She stepped into his silence without fear. She stepped into his understanding without judgment. She stepped into the rhythm of his existence with a gentleness no specialist had ever shown. And because she stepped into his world, Evan began slowly reaching toward hers. She noticed it one afternoon when she was polishing the banister. She tapped once, just a simple acknowledgement of his presence behind her. He tapped back, but then he did something new. He tapped a different rhythm, not a copy of hers, but his own, a pattern he created. Marion froze. This was no longer imitation. This was expression. He was speaking, in his way, in his language, and he was trusting her enough to share it. She turned, moving slowly so he wouldn't retreat, and tapped his pattern back at him. His eyes widened with recognition that she understood him, that his message reached its destination, that he wasn't alone in his language anymore. As days passed, their vibration language deepened. Tap, tap, tap slide meant I like this. 2 quick taps followed by one long one meant I want to show you something. A vibration through a shared surface, from her hand on a counter to his palm on the same counter, meant I'm here with you. They built a vocabulary of feeling instead of words, a grammar of trust instead of grammar rules, and the mansion began to acknowledge something extraordinary. The maid no one noticed had discovered the key no one else ever found. Richard watched from afar, baffled. The therapists whispered with confusion. The nannies tried to replicate Marion's techniques and failed, because it wasn't about tapping, it wasn't even about rhythm, it was about intent. Marion didn't tap to teach or test, she tapped to connect. She tapped to meet a boy where he lived, in stillness, in vibration, in quiet existence that spoke volumes when someone cared enough to listen without ears. Evan's world expanded because someone finally stopped trying to fix him and instead tried to understand him. And every time Marion tapped, the walls between their worlds thinned a little more. Every time he tapped back, she felt the unmistakable truth. He had been waiting all this time for someone to speak his language, and she had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone who understood her silence too. One night during a storm, lightning tore across the sky with a crack so sharp it seemed to split the world in two. The East Wing's power line took the direct hit. In an instant, the entire mansion shuddered as the electricity surged and then died. The lights flickered once, twice, then everything went black. Thunder rolled through the walls like a giant fist pounding from the outside. Evan bolted upright in his bed, his senses flooded with panic. He couldn't hear the storm, but he felt it, every vibration of thunder shaking through the floors, every tremor trembling through the beams, every silent flash of lightning illuminating the darkness in violent bursts. His breath hitched, his fingers curled into fists. Then he ran. Barefoot and trembling, he darted through the dark hallways, guided only by instinct and fear. His hands skimmed along the walls, feeling every vibration, every shift in the house's structure. Lightning flashed again, lighting up a corridor for a split second, and he sprinted blindly straight into Marion. She had been making her way toward the west wing with a flashlight when he collided with her. He smacked into her chest hard enough to nearly knock her backward, but she didn't let him fall. She grabbed him, steady and gentle, her arms forming a shield around his shaking body. She didn't speak, because she knew words meant nothing in this moment. Instead, she mouthed them slowly, letting him see the calm in her expression. "I'm here." Evan's breaths were short, sharp bursts, the kind that came from pure terror. His hands clutched at her shirt, and he pressed his forehead against her shoulder as if trying to hide from the entire universe. Marion placed one hand softly on his arm and tapped a new rhythm, one she had never used before. It was slow, warm, deliberate. "You're safe, I'm here. You're safe, I'm here." Evan's trembling began to ease, but only slightly. His body still shook with a fear deeper than anything she'd seen from him before. And then, in the darkness lit only by occasional flashes of lightning, he did something he had never done before, something so fragile and vulnerable that Marion felt her heart splinter. He took her hand in both of his and placed it on his chest. His small fingers pressed her palm against his pounding heartbeat. Then he tapped, not on the wall, not on the floor, not on the furniture, but on his own chest, using her hand as the transmitter. The pattern was uneven, shaky, frightened, desperate. Marion didn't understand it at first. It didn't match any rhythm they had created together. It wasn't a word from their language, it wasn't a request, it wasn't a greeting, it was raw, it was trembling, it was pain. He repeated it. Tap, 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 pause, tap. Tap, 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 pause, tap. And suddenly Marion froze, her breath caught. A chill ran through her bloodstream like ice. She had felt that rhythm before, not in the house, not from Evan, but in life. It was the rhythm of someone pounding on a locked door, slow at first, then frantic, then desperate. She looked at him, really looked, as lightning lit up his face for a heartbeat. His eyes were wide, pleading, begging her to understand. He didn't stop tapping. The message was clear now that she recognized its shape. Help me, help me, help me. The rhythm of fear. The rhythm of someone trapped. The rhythm of memory. Marion felt her stomach twist. Her mind raced. Something had happened to Evan before she ever arrived. Something terrifying enough that he remembered it not as sound, but as vibration. Something that made him freeze when footsteps approached too fast. Something that made him hide when doors closed behind him. Something that made him trust vibrations more than people. Richard didn't know. Marion was certain of it. The billionaire father, stern, loud, desperate to fix things but blinded by worry, had no idea his son carried a silent trauma carved into his very bones. But Evan was finally telling someone, not through words, not through drawings, not through signs, through the only language he had, vibration. His heartbeat against her palm thudded in the same frantic rhythm of the memory he was sharing. He wasn't just remembering, he was reliving it. The storm outside roared in silence around them, but the real storm was happening inside that trembling child. Marion tightened her arms around him, holding him steady as he tapped the rhythm again and again and again, until the message sank deep into her heart. Something had happened behind a locked door. Someone had trapped him. Someone had frightened him, and he had never been able to tell anyone until now. Marion pressed her palm more firmly against his chest and tapped a new rhythm against his heart. "I understand, Ipramis, Iwant Leviu." Evan shuddered, and in that moment Marion Brooks knew this child's silence wasn't natural, it was protective, and whatever secret lived inside that silence, it wasn't over. The next morning, before the mansion fully woke, before the staff filled the hallways with clattering trays and whispered schedules, Marion stood outside Richard's office with her hand hovering over the door. She could feel the weight of the night still clinging to her, Evan trembling in her arms, the storm shaking the house, the terrified rhythm he tapped on his chest that revealed more than words ever could. She knocked once. Richard's tired voice answered, "Come in." Looked exhausted, pale, with dark circles bruising the skin beneath his eyes. He hadn't slept, she could tell. He stared at her with a heaviness that made her heart tighten. She took a breath. "Sir, your son wasn't born afraid," she said softly but firmly. "Children don't hide trauma for no reason." Richard stiffened, his fingers curling into fists on top of his desk. "What are you saying?" His voice was guarded, defensive, confused, and already afraid of the answer. Marion stepped closer. For a moment she hesitated, because the truth felt like a fragile thing, something she had no right to touch. But then she remembered Evan tapping desperately against his own chest. She remembered the message, the fear, the pleading. She remembered the rhythm of a locked door being pounded from the inside. So she told Richard everything, every detail of the rhythm Evan had shared, the tremble in his movements, the panic in his heartbeat, the sheer terror etched into the vibrations of his memory. When she finished, the room went cold with silence. Richard didn't speak. His eyes dropped to the floor, and for a moment he looked smaller, older, like a man carrying a grief so heavy it had bent him inward. His voice finally broke the air in a whisper so quiet Marion barely caught it. "Before my wife died, she had severe postpartum psychosis." He swallowed hard. His jaw clenched, as if the memory itself hurt to speak. One night she locked Evan in a room because she thought someone was coming to take him. Marion's breath caught. Richard continued, his voice trembling. He was only 2. The words hung between them like a storm cloud. A child barely old enough to walk steadily, barely old enough to form memories, locked in a dark room while his mother, lost in delusion, pounded on the door from the outside, screaming at shadows that didn't exist. Evan wouldn't have understood a single thing that happened. But he would have felt everything. The vibration of fists hitting wood, the tremors of fear radiating through the floor, the confusion of being trapped, the terror of not understanding why, and the silence that followed when someone finally opened the door. Marion's heart cracked wide open. All the signs made sense now, not because Evan was deaf, but because he had learned to read the world through vibrations long before anyone realized why. Trauma had shaped him more than silence ever had. Richard pressed his palms to his eyes. I thought he didn't remember," he whispered. "He was so young. The doctors said he wouldn't retain anything. They said children forget." Marion shook her head gently. "Children don't forget fear," she murmured. "Not the kind they can feel in their bones." Richard flinched at her words but didn't argue. He knew she was right. He had always known something was wrong, something deeper than silence, something more painful than simple fearfulness. But he had never known how to reach his son, how to ask him, how to understand. Now he did, but the truth hurt more than ignorance ever had. Marion didn't pity Evan. Pity meant distance. Pity meant helplessness. She felt something else: recognition, understanding, respect for a child who survived fear in a world that could not hear him scream. She believed him. She believed every trembling tap of the memories he entrusted to her. And because she believed him, something shifted inside her, inside the house, inside the very foundation of the story unfolding between them. Believing Evan changed everything. 3 months passed in quiet rhythms and small victories, months filled with tapping patterns, shared vibrations, and silent conversations that no one outside the West Wing could understand. Marion had settled into a routine with Evan that defied logic and expectation, a language built from knuckles against wood, the hum of cleaning machines, the soft rumble of furniture shifting, and every imperceptible tremor that carried meaning only to them. The boy who had once shrunk from every movement now followed her from room to room, tracing her steps, waiting for the gentle pulses that signaled attention, safety, and trust. Every day, Marion recorded the rhythms, noted the changes, but the milestones were subtle. A flicker of a smile here, a longer tap there, a softer reaction to footsteps approaching, all small blossoms of progress that would have been invisible to anyone who didn't stop to watch. And then, one morning, everything changed. Marion walked into the playroom as she always did, her shoes silent on the polished floor, her hand ready to tap their usual greeting. Tap, tap, hello. The rhythm was slow and deliberate, a call, a signal, a shared moment of understanding. She waited. Evan stood on the other side of the room, his small frame still, his eyes wide and unblinking. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Marion's chest tightened. He hadn't tapped back. He hadn't followed the rhythm. Something froze inside her, not fear, but the awareness that the moment might not come. And then, as lightning splits the sky in a storm of realization, he opened his mouth. A tiny, shaky whisper drifted through the still air of the playroom. Mari, the word faltered, suspended in uncertainty. He couldn't finish it. He didn't need to. The sound itself, a fragile, trembling syllable, carried the weight of years he had spent silent, of walls built brick by brick around his voice, of nights spent listening to a world he could never fully enter. Marion's knees buckled beneath her. She sank to the floor, tears spilling over, blurring the edges of the world, drowning out the playroom walls and the polished toys scattered around them. She pressed her hand to her heart, feeling the rapid pulse of hope, disbelief, and overwhelming emotion crashing through her. This was more than speech. This was life erupting after long winters of silence. The boy who had never spoken, who had recoiled from every sound, who had taught the world that words were optional when trust was absent, had spoken his first syllable. not for the speech therapists who had visited with clipboards and schedules, insisting on phonics and repetition. Not for the billionaire father who had spent years trying to teach, coax, and pressure him into language. Not for the psychologists who had drawn charts and taken notes. But for Marion, the quiet maid who moved through the mansion without demand, without notice, without expectation. She had listened without ears, had observed without judgment, had entered his world without trying to change it. And he had chosen to speak to her. Richard, standing frozen in the doorway, had been watching silently. His hands covered his mouth. His eyes glistened, his chest rising and falling with shallow breaths as a tidal wave of emotion swept through him. He had never believed he would witness this. He had never imagined that the boy he had feared would never speak. The boy who had endured the loneliness of a mind trapped behind silence would reach out with the simplest, most fragile word, a name. His wife's memory, the terror, the trauma, all the years of attempts and failures, all the money spent on specialists, shrank in that moment to insignificance beside the miracle unfolding before him. Evan's lips trembled as he repeated the syllable, this time with more certainty, Mari. Each attempt brought a new flicker of confidence. His eyes locked on hers, brimming with recognition, trust, and a silent apology for all the years he had lived unheard. Marion reached for him gently, placing both hands over his small ones, feeling the vibrations of excitement radiating through his body. She tapped a rhythm back, not to instruct, but to acknowledge, to celebrate, to communicate. I hear you, I am here. He mirrored her taps, lighter now, steadier, as if testing the waters of sound against the ocean of his silence. The room seemed to expand around them, the mansion holding its breath. Even the walls, the furniture, the toys scattered across the carpet, all seemed to pause in recognition of this moment, the impossible made real. Richard stepped forward slowly, careful not to startle his son, and knelt beside them, his hand brushing Evan's shoulder with the gentlest touch. Tears streamed down his face as he whispered, you're safe now. Evan glanced at him, eyes wide with a mixture of fear and understanding, before returning to Marion. He didn't need to speak to her. The bond forged through months of vibration and trust had created a bridge no words could cross in such a short time. And yet the first sound, the syllable that pierced through years of silence, was hers. Marion held him close, rocking slightly, whispering to herself more than to him, you can speak, you are heard, you are safe. The playroom, once a place of quiet observation, became a cathedral of miracles. Outside, the sun broke through clouds, sending a warm beam through the window that landed across the boy and the maid, bathing them in gold. For the first time, Evan's voice had been heard, and in that sound, everyone present understood. Patience, presence, and true understanding had triumphed where training, money, and power had failed. The impossible had happened. Evan had spoken, and the world, for that first time, would listen. Evan soon learned a combination of vibrations, touch sign language, and eventually real signing. His speech came slowly, but every sound was a triumph. The mansion changed. The walls felt brighter. Richard stopped drowning in work. Evan stopped hiding. And Marion. Richard offered her a permanent position, not as a maid, but as Evan's official developmental mentor with full pay and benefits. Miss Brooks, he said, voice trembling, you didn't just help my son, you reached him in a way none of us ever could. Marion smiled warmly. I didn't reach him, sir, I just followed the beat he was already making. Years later, Evan became a pioneer in assistive vibration technology, creating devices for deaf children to feel communication through rhythmic patterns. At every award ceremony, he stood on stage and touched his chest twice, Marion's signal for gratitude. And in every interview, he said the same thing. I learned language from the woman the world didn't see. She saved me without saying a word.